This is a continuation of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, comprising Part 3, Chapters 9 through 14.
Part 3, Chapter 9. While the village of Luce was crowded with hunters of men, wounded, dead, batches of panic-stricken prisoners, women, doctors, Highlanders and Lowlanders, fey with the intoxication of blood, London soldiers with tattered uniforms and muddy rifles and stained bayonets, mixed brigades were moving forward to new objectives. The orders of the Scottish troops, which I saw, were to go all out and to press on as far as they could, with the absolute assurance that all the ground they gained would be held behind them by supporting troops, and having that promise, they trudged on to Hill 70. The Londoners had been ordered to make a defensive flank on the right of the Scots by capturing the chalk pit south of Luce and digging in. They did this after savage fighting in the pit, where they wanted many Germans, though raked by machine gun bullets from a neighbouring copse, which was a fringe of gashed and tattered trees. But some of the London boys were mixed up with the advancing Scots and went on with them, and a battalion of Scots Fusiliers who had been in the supporting brigade of the 15th Division, which was intended to follow the advance, joined the first assault, either through eagerness or a wrong order, and, unknown to their brigadier, were among the leaders in the bloody struggle in Luce, and laboured on to Hill 70, where Cameron's, Gordon's Black Watch, Seaforth's, Argyll, and Sutherland men and Londoners were now up the slopes, stabbing stray Germans who were trying to retreat to a redoubt on the reverse side of the hill. For a time there was a kind of bank holiday crowd on Hill 70. The German gunners, knowing that the redoubt on the crest was still held by their men, dared not fire, and many German batteries were on the move, out of Lens and from their secret lairs in the country thereabouts, in a state of panic. On our right the French were fighting desperately at Sauchez and Neuville-Saint-Vaast, and up the lower slopes of Vimy, suffering horrible casualties and failing to gain the heights in spite of the reckless valour of their men, but alarming the German staffs, who for a time had lost touch with the situation. Their telephones had been destroyed by gunfire and were filled with gloomy apprehensions. So Hill 70 was quiet, except for spasms of machine gun fire from the redoubt on the German side of the slope and the bombing of German dugouts, or the bayoneting of single men routed out from holes in the earth. One of our men came face to face with 4 Germans, 2 of whom were armed with rifles and 2 with bombs. They were standing in the wreckage of a trench, pallid, and with the fear of death in their eyes. The rifles clattered to the earth, the bombs fell at their feet, and their hands went up when the young Scot appeared before them with his bayonet down. He was alone, and they could have killed him, but surrendered, and were glad of the life he granted them. As more men came up the slope there were greetings between comrades of, "Hullo, Jock. Is that you, Alf?" They were rummaging about for souvenirs in half-destroyed dugouts where dead bodies lay. They were swapping souvenirs taken from prisoners' silver watches, tobacco boxes, revolvers, compasses. Many of them put on German field caps, like schoolboys with paper caps from Christmas crackers, shouting with laughter because of their German look. They thought the battle was won. After the first wild rush, the shell fire, the killing, the sight of dead comrades, the smell of blood, the nightmare of that hour after dawn, they were beginning to get normal again, to be conscious of themselves, to rejoice in their luck at having got so far with whole skins. It had been a fine victory. The enemy was nowhere. He had mizzled off. Some of the Scots, with the hunter's instinct still strong, decided to go on still farther to a new objective. They straggled away in batches to one of the suburbs of Lens, the Sights and Auguste. Very few of them came back with the tale of their comrades' slaughter by sudden bursts of machine gun fire, which cut off all chance of retreat. The quietude of Hill 70 was broken by the beginning of a new bombardment from German guns. "Dig in," said the officers. "We must hold on at all costs until the supports come up." Where were the supporting troops which had been promised? There was no sign of them coming forward from Luce. The Scots were strangely isolated on the slopes of Hill 70. At night the sky above them was lit up by the red glow of fires in Lens, and at 12:30 that night, under that ruddy sky, dark figures moved on the east of the hill, and a storm of machine gun bullets swept down on the Highlanders and Lowlanders, who crouched low in the mangled earth. It was a counter-attack by masses of men crawling up to the crest from the reverse side and trying to get the Scots out of the slopes below. But the men of the 15th Division answered by volleys of rifle fire, machine gun fire, and bombs. They held on in spite of dead and wounded men thinning out their fighting strength. At 5:30 in the morning, there was another strong counter-attack, repulsed also, but at another price of life in those holes and ditches on the hillside. Scottish officers stared anxiously back toward their old lines. Where were the supports? Why did they get no help? Why were they left clinging like this to an isolated hill? The German artillery had reorganized. They were barraging the ground about Loos fiercely and continuously. They were covering a great stretch of country up to Hulloch, and north of it, with intense harassing fire. Later on that Saturday morning, the 15th Division received orders to attack and capture the German earthwork redoubt on the crest of the hill. A brigade of the 21st Division was nominally in support of them, but only small groups of that brigade appeared on the scene. A few white-faced officers, savage with anger, almost mad with some despair in them, with batches of English lads who looked famished with hunger, weak after long marching, demoralized by some tragedy that had happened to them. They were Scots who did most of the work in trying to capture the redoubt, the same Scots who had fought through Loos. They tried to reach the crest. Again and again they crawled forward and up, but the blasts of machine gun fire mowed them down, and many young Scots lay motionless on those chalky slopes, with their kilts riddled with bullets. Others, hit in the head, or arms, or legs, writhed like snakes back to the cover of broken trenches. "Where are the supports?" asked the Scottish officers. "In God's name, where are the troops who were to follow on? Why did we do all this bloody fighting to be hung up in the air like this?" The answer to their question has not been given in any official dispatch. It is answered by the tragedy of the 21st and 24th Divisions, who will never forget the misery of that day, though not many are now alive who suffered it. Their part of the battle I will tell later. Part 3, Chapter 10. To onlookers there were some of the signs of victory on that day of September 25th, of victory and its price. I met great numbers of the lightly wounded men, mostly jocks, and they were in exalted spirits, because they had done well in this ordeal and had come through it and out of it alive. They came straggling back through the villages behind the lines to the casualty clearing stations and ambulance trains. Some of them had the sleeves of their tunics cut away and showed brown, brawny arms tightly bandaged and smeared with blood. Some of them were wounded in the legs and hobbled with their arms about their comrades' necks. Their kilts were torn and plastered with chalky mud. Nearly all of them had some souvenir of the fighting German watches, caps, cartridges. They carried themselves with a warrior look, so hard, so lean, so clear-eyed, these young Scots of the Black Watch and Camerons and Gordons. They told tales of their own adventure in broad Scots, hard to understand, and laughed grimly at the killing they had done, though here and there a lad among them had a look of bad remembrance in his eyes, and older men spoke gravely of the scenes on the battlefield and called it hellish. But their pride was high. They had done what they had been asked to do. The 15th Division had proved its quality. Their old battalions, famous in history, had gained new honor. Thousands of those lightly wounded men swarmed about a long ambulance train standing in a field near the village of Chokes. They crowded the carriages, leaned out of the windows with their bandaged heads and arms, shouting at friends they saw in the other crowds. The spirit of victory and of lucky escape uplifted those lads, drugged them, and now they were going home for a spell. Home to bonny Scotland, with a wound that would take some time to heal. There were other wounded men from whom no laughter came, nor any sound. They were carried to the train on stretchers, laid down a while on the wooden platforms, covered with blankets up to their chins, unless they uncovered themselves with convulsive movements. I saw one young Londoner so smashed about the face that only his eyes were uncovered between layers of bandages, and they were glazed with the first film of death. Another had his jaw blown clean away, so the doctor told me, and the upper half of his face was livid and discolored by explosive gases. A splendid boy of the Black Watch was but a living trunk. Both his arms and both his legs were shattered. If he lived after butcher's work of surgery, he would be one of those who go about in boxes on wheels, from whom men turn their eyes away, sick with a sense of horror. There were blind boys led to the train by wounded comrades, groping, very quiet, thinking of a life of darkness ahead of them forever in the darkness which shut in their souls. For days and weeks that followed, there was always a procession of ambulances on the way to the dirty little town of Lillers, and going along the roads I used to look back at them and see the soles of muddy boots, upturned below brown blankets. It was more human wreckage coming down from the salient of Loos, from the chalk pits of Hulloch, and the tumbled earth of the Hohenzollern redoubt, which had been partly gained by the battle which did not succeed. Outside a square brick building, which was the town hall of Lillers, and for a time a casualty clearing station, the bad cases were unloaded. Men with chunks of steel in their lungs and bowels were vomiting great gobs of blood. Men with arms and legs torn from their trunks, men without noses, and their brains throbbing through open scalps, men without faces. Part 3, Chapter 11. To a field behind the railway station near the grimy village of Chokes, on the edge of this black country of France, the prisoners were brought, and I went among them and talked with some of them on a Sunday morning, when now the rain had stopped and there was a blue sky overhead and good visibility for German guns and ours. There were 1,400 German prisoners awaiting entrainment, a mass of slate-grey men lying on the wet earth in huddled heaps of misery, while a few of our fresh-faced Tommies stood among them with fixed bayonets. They were the men who had surrendered from deep dugouts in the trenches between us and Loos, and from the cellars of Loos itself. They had seen many of their comrades bayonetted. Some of them had shrieked for mercy. Others had not shrieked, having no power of sound in their throats, but had shrunk back at the sight of glinting bayonets with an animal fear of death. Now all that was a nightmare memory, and they were out of it all until the war should end. Next year, the year after that, who could tell? They had been soaked to the skin in the night, and their grey uniforms were still soddened. Many of them were sleeping in huddled, grotesque postures, like dead men, some lying on their stomachs, face downward. Others were awake, sitting hunched up, with drooping heads and a beaten, exhausted look. Others paced up and down, like caged animals as they were, famished and parched, until we could distribute the rations. Many of them were dying, and a German ambulanceman went among them, injecting them with morphine to ease the agony which made them writhe and groan. 2 men held their stomachs, moaning and whimpering with a pain that gnawed their bowels, caused by cold and damp. They cried out to me, asking for a doctor. A friend of mine carried a water jar to some of the wounded and held it to their lips. One of them refused. He was a tall, evil-looking fellow with a bloody rag round his head, a typical Hun, I thought. But he pointed to a comrade who lay gasping beside him and said, in German, he needs it first. This man had never heard of Sir Philip Sidney, who at Zutphen, when thirsty and near death, said, his need is greater than mine, but he had the same chivalry in his soul. The officer in charge of their escort could not speak German and had no means of explaining to the prisoners that they were to take their turn to get rations and water at a dump nearby. It was a war correspondent, young Valentine Williams, afterward a very gallant officer in the Irish Guards, who gave the orders in fluent and incisive German. He began with a hoarse shout of Achtung, and that old word of command had an electrical effect on many of the men. Even those who had seemed asleep staggered to their feet and stood at attention. The habit of discipline was part of their very life, and men almost dead strove to obey. The non-commissioned officers formed parties to draw and distribute the rations, and then those prisoners clutched at hunks of bread and ate in a famished way, like starved beasts. Some of them had been 4 days hungry, cut off from their supplies by our barrage fire, and intense hunger gave them a kind of vitality when food appeared. The sight of that mass of men reduced to such depths of human misery was horrible. One had no hate in one's heart for them then. Poor devils, said an officer with me. Poor beasts. Here we see the glory of war, the romance of war. Ah. I spoke to some of them in bad German and understood their answer. It is better here than on the battlefield, said one of them. We are glad to be prisoners. One of them waved his hand toward the tumult of guns which were firing ceaselessly. I pity our poor people there, he said. One of them, who spoke English, described all he had seen of the battle, which was not much, because no man at such a time sees more than what happens within a yard or two. The English caught us by surprise when the attack came at last, he said. The bombardment had been going on for days, and we could not guess when the attack would begin. I was in a deep dugout, wondering how long it would be before a shell came through the roof and blow us to pieces. The earth shook above our heads, wounded men crawled into the dugout, and some of them died down there. We sat looking at their bodies in the doorway and up the steps. I climbed over them when a lull came. A friend of mine was there, dead, and I stepped on his stomach to get upstairs. The first thing I saw was a crowd of your soldiers streaming past our trenches. We were surrounded on 3 sides, and our position was hopeless. Some of our men started firing, but it was only asking for death. Your men killed them with bayonets. I went back into my dugout and waited. Presently there was an explosion in the doorway and part of the dugout fell in. One of the men with me had his head blown off, and his blood spurted on me. I was dazed, but through the fumes I saw an English soldier in a petticoat standing at the doorway, making ready to throw another bomb. I shouted to him in English, "Don't kill us, we surrender." He was silent for a second or two, and I thought he would throw his bomb. Then he said, "Come out, you swine." So we went out and saw many soldiers in petticoats, your Highlanders, with bayonets. They wanted to kill us, but one man argued with them in words I could not understand, a dialect, and we were told to go along a trench. Even then we expected death, but came to another group of prisoners and joined them on their way back. Gott sei Dank. He spoke gravely and simply, this dirty, bearded man, who had been a clerk in a London office. He had the truthfulness of a man who had just come from great horrors. Many of the men around him were Silesians, more Polish than German. Some of them could not speak more than a few words of German, and were true Slavs in physical type, with flat cheekbones. A group of German artillery officers had been captured, and they were behaving with studied arrogance and insolence as they smoked cigarettes apart from the men, and looked in a jeering way at our officers. "Did you get any of our gas this morning?" I asked them, and one of them laughed and shrugged his shoulders. I smelled it a little. It was rather nice. The English always imitate the German war methods, but without much success. They grinned and imitated my way of saying Guten Tag when I left them. It took a year or more to tame the arrogance of the German officer. At the end of the Somme battles, he changed his manner when captured and was very polite. In another place, a prison in St. Omer, I had a conversation with two other officers of the German army who were more courteous than the gunners. They had been taken at Hooge and were both Prussians, one a stout captain, smiling behind horn spectacles, with a false, jovial manner, hiding the effect of the ordeal from which he had just escaped, and his hatred of us. The other a young, slim fellow with clear-cut features, who was very nervous, but bowed repeatedly, with his heels together, as though in a cafe at Ehrenbreitstein, when high officers came in. A few hours before he had been buried alive. One of our mines had exploded under him, flinging a heap of earth over him. The fat man by his side, his captain, had been buried, too, in the dugout. They had scraped themselves out by clawing at the earth. They were cautious about answering questions on the war, but the younger man said they were prepared down to the last gaiter for another winter campaign, and that seemed to me at the time a fine touch of audacity, for 2 more winter campaigns if need be. The winter of 16, after this autumn, and winter of 15, and then after that the winter of 17. The words of that young Prussian seemed to me, the more I thought of them, idiotic and almost insane. Why, the world itself could not suffer 2 more years of war. It would end before then in general anarchy, the wild revolutions of armies on all fronts. Humanity of every nation would revolt against such prolonged slaughter. It was I who was mad, in the foolish faith that the war would end before another year had passed, because I thought that would be the limit of endurance of such mutual massacre. In a room next to those 2 officers a week, before this battle, the captain had been rowing with his wife on the lake at Potsdam, was another prisoner, who wept and wept. He had escaped to our lines before the battle to save his skin, and now was conscience-stricken and thought he had lost his soul. What stabbed his conscience most was the thought that his wife and children would lose their allowances because of his treachery. He stared at us with wild, red eyes. "Ach, mein armes Weib, meine Kinder, ach, Gott in Himmel." He had no pride, no dignity, no courage. This tall, bearded man, father of a family, put his hands against the wall and laid his head on his arm and wept. Part 3, Chapter 12. During the battle, for several days I went with other men to various points of view, trying to see something of the human conflict from slag heaps and rising ground, but could only see the swirl and flurry of gunfire and the smoke of shells mixing with wet mist, and the backwash of wounded and prisoners, and the traffic of guns and wagons and supporting troops. Like an ant on the edge of a volcano, I sat among the slag heaps with gunner observers, who were listening at telephones dumped down in the fields and connected with artillery brigades and field batteries. "The Guards are fighting round Fosse 8, said one of these observers. Through the mist I could see Fosse 8, a flat-topped hill of coal dust. Little glinting lights were playing about it, like confetti shining in the sun. That was German shrapnel, eruptions of red flame and black earth vomited out of the hill. That was German high explosive. For a time on Monday, September 27th, it was the storm's center of battle. "What's that?" asked an artillery staff officer with his ear to the field telephone. "What's that? Hello, are you there? The Guards have been kicked off Fosse 8. Oh, hell." From all parts of the field of battle such whispers came to listening men and were passed on to headquarters, where other men listened. This brigade was doing pretty well. That was hard-pressed. The Germans were counter-attacking heavily. Their barrage was strong and our casualties heavy. "Oh, hell," said other men. From behind the mist came the news of life and death, revealing things which no onlooker could see. I went closer to see into the center of the arc of battle, up by the Loos redoubt, where the German dead and ours still lay in heaps. John Buchan was my companion on that walk, and together we stood staring over the edge of a trench to where, grim and gaunt against the grey sky, loomed the high, steel columns of the Tower Bridge, the mining works which I had seen before the battle as an inaccessible landmark in the German lines. Now they were within our lines in the center of Loos, and no longer leering at us, as an officer once told me they used to do when he led his men into communication trenches under their observation. Behind us now was the turmoil of war, thousands and scores of thousands of men moving in steady columns forward and backward in the queer, tangled way which during a great battle seems to have no purpose or meaning except to the directing brains on the headquarters staff, and, sometimes in history, none to them. Vast convoys of transports choked the roads, with teams of mules harnessed to wagons and gun limbers, with trains of motor ambulances packed with wounded men, with infantry brigades plodding through the slush and slime, with divisional cavalry halted in the villages and great bivouacs in the boggy fields. The men, Londoners and Scots, and Guards and Yorkshires and Leinsters, passed and repassed in dense masses, in small battalions, in scattered groups. One could tell them from those who were filling their places by the white chalk which covered them from head to foot, and sometimes by the blood which had splashed them. Regiments which had lost many of their comrades, and had fought in attack and counter-attack through those days and nights, went very silently, and no man cheered them. Legions of tall lads, who a few months before marched smart, and trimmed down English lanes, trudged toward the fighting lines of the burden of their heavy packs, with all their smartness befouled by the business of war, but wonderful and pitiful to see because of the look of courage and the gravity in their eyes as they went up to dreadful places. Farther away, within the zone of the enemy's fire, the traffic ceased, and I came into the desolate lands of death, where there is but little movement, and the only noise is that of guns. I passed by ruined villages and towns. To the left was Vermelles. 2 months before death nearly caught me there, and I stared at those broken houses and roofless farms and fallen churches which used to make one's soul shiver even when they stood clear in the daylight. To the right, a few hundred yards away, was Massinger Bay, from which many of our troops marched out to begin the great attack. Farther back were the great slag heaps of Nuaxlis mines, and all around other black hills of this mining country which rise out of the flat plain. It was a long walk through narrow trenches toward that Loos redoubt where at last I stood. There was the smell of death in those narrow, winding ways. One boy whom death had taken almost at the entrance way knelt on the fire step, with his head bent and his forehead against the wet clay, as though in prayer. Farther on, other bodies of London boys and Scots lay huddled up. We were in the centre of a wide field of fire, with the enemy's batteries on one side and ours on the other in sweeping semicircles. The shells of all these batteries went crying through the air with high, whining sighs, which ended in the cough of death. The roar of the guns was incessant and very close. The enemy was sweeping a road to my right, and his shells went overhead with a continual rush, passing our shells, which answered back. The whole sky was filled with these thunderbolts. Many of them were Jack Johnsons, which raised a volume of black smoke where they fell. I wondered how it would feel to be caught by one of them, whether one would have any consciousness before being scattered. Fear, which had walked with me part of the way, left me for a time. I had a strange sense of exhilaration, an intoxicated interest in this foul scene and the activity of that shell fire. Peering over the parapet, we saw the whole panorama of the battleground. It was but an ugly, naked plain, rising up to Hullock and Hazeners on the north, falling down to Loos on the east, from where we stood, and rising again to Hill 70, now in German hands again, still farther east and a little south. The villages of Hazeners and Hullock fretted the skyline, and Fossate was a black wart between them. The Tower Bridge, close by in the town of Loos, was the one high landmark which broke the monotony of this desolation. No men moved about this ground, yet thousands of men were hidden about us in the ditches, waiting for another counterattack behind storms of fire. The only moving things were the shells which vomited up earth and smoke and steel as they burst in all directions over the whole zone. We were shelling Hullock and Hazeners and Fossate with an intense, concentrated fire, and the enemy was retaliating by scattering shells over the town of Loos and our new line between Hill 70 and the chalk pit, and the whole length of our line from north to south. Only 2 men moved about above the trenches. They were 2 London boys carrying a gas cylinder and whistling as though it were a health resort under the autumn sun. It was not a health resort. It stank of death, from piles of corpses, all mangled and in a mush of flesh and bones, lying around the Loos redoubt and all the ground in this neighbourhood, and for a long distance north. Through the streets of Bethune streamed a tide of war. The transport of divisions, gun teams with their limber ambulance convoys, ammunition wagons, infantry moving up to the front, dispatch riders, staff officers, signallers, and a great host of men and mules and motor cars. The rain lashed down upon the crowds, waterproofs and Burberrys, and the tarpaulin covers of forage carts streamed with water, and the bronzed faces of the soldiers were dripping wet. Mud splashed them to the thighs. Fountains of mud spurted up from the wheels of gun carriages. The chill of winter made Highlanders as well as Indians, those poor, brave, wretched Indians who had been flung into the holding attack on the canal at La Bassée and mown down in the inevitable way by shrapnel and machine-gun bullets, shiver in the wind. Yet, in spite of rain and great death, there was a spirit of exultation among many fighting men. At last there was a break in the months of stationary warfare. We were up and out of the trenches. The first proofs of victory were visible there in a long line of German guns captured at Loos, guarded on each side by British soldiers with fixed bayonets. Men moving up did not know the general failure that had swamped a partial success. They stared at the guns and said, "By God, we've got him going this time." A group of French civilians gathered round them, excited at the sight. Artillery officers examined their broken breech blocks and their inscriptions. Pro Gloria et Patria. Ultima Ratio Regis. The irony of the words made some of the onlookers laugh. A French interpreter spoke to some English officers with a thrill of joy in his voice. Had they heard the last news from Champagne? The French had broken through the enemy's line. The Germans were in full retreat. It was utterly untrue, because after the desperate valor of heroic youth and horrible casualties, the French attack had broken down. But the spirit of hope came down the cold wind and went with the men whom I saw marching to the fields of fate in the slanting rain, as the darkness and the mist came to end another day of battle. Outside the headquarters of a British Army corps stood another line of captured field guns and several machine guns, of which one had a strange history of adventure. It was a Russian machine gun, taken by the Germans on the Eastern Front and retaken by us on the Western Front. In General Rawlinson's headquarters, I saw a queer piece of booty. It was a big bronze bell, used by the Germans in their trenches to signal a British gas attack. General Rawlinson was taking tea in his chateau when I called on him, and was having an animated argument with Lord Cavan, commanding the guards, as to the disposal of the captured artillery and other trophies. Lord Cavan claimed some for his own, with some violence of speech. But General Rawlinson was bright and breezy as usual. Our losses were not worrying him. As a great general, he did not allow losses to worry him. He ate his tea with a hearty appetite and chaffed his staff officers. They were anticipating the real German counter-attack, a big affair. Away up the line there would be more dead piled up, more filth and stench of human slaughter, but the smell of it would not reach back to headquarters. Part 3, Chapter 13. In a dispatch by Sir John French, dated October 15, 1915, and issued by the War Office on November 1st of that year, the Commander-in-Chief stated that, in view of the great length of line along which the British troops were operating, it was necessary to keep a strong reserve in my own hand. The 11th Corps, consisting of the Guards, the 21st and the 24th Divisions, were detailed for this purpose. This reserve was the more necessary owing to the fact that the 10th French Army had to postpone its attack until 1 o'clock in the day, and further, that the corps operating on the French left had to be directed in a more or less southeasterly direction, involving, in case of our success, a considerable gap in our line. To ensure, however, the speedy and effective support of the 1st and 4th Corps, in the case of their success, the 21st and 24th Divisions passed the night of the 24th and 25th on the line Beuvry, to the east of Bethune, les Mines. The Guards Division was in the neighborhood of Lillers on the same night. By that statement, and by the facts that happened in accordance with it, the whole scheme of attack in the Battle of Loos will stand challenged in history. Lord French admits in that dispatch that he held his reserves in his own hand, and later he states that it was not until 9:30 on the morning of battle that I placed the 24th Divisions at the disposal of the general officer commanding First Army. He still held the Guards. He makes, as a defense of the decision to hold back the reserves, the extraordinary statement that there would be a considerable gap in our line in case of our success. That is to say, he was actually envisaging a gap in the line if the attack succeeded according to his expectations, and risking the most frightful catastrophe that may befall any army in an assault upon a powerful enemy, provided with enormous reserves, as the Germans were at that time, and as our commander-in-chief ought to have known. But apart from that, the whole timetable of the battle was, as it now appears, fatally wrong. To move divisions along narrow roads requires an immense amount of time, even if the roads are clear, and those roads toward Loos were crowded with the transport and gun limbers of the assaulting troops. To move them in daylight to the trenches meant inevitable loss of life and almost certain demoralization under the enemy's gunfire. Between 11 a.m. and 12 noon, the central brigade of these divisions filed past me at Bethune and Les Mines, respectively, wrote Sir John French. It was not possible for them to reach our old trenches until 4 p.m. It was General Sir Frederick Maurice, the Chief of Staff, who revealed that fact to me afterward in an official explanation, and it was confirmed by battalion officers of the 24th Division whom I met. That timetable led to disaster. By 8 o'clock in the morning there were Scots on Hill 70. They had been told to go all out, with the promise that the ground they gained would be consolidated by following troops. Yet no supports were due to arrive until 4 p.m. at our original line of attack, still a way back from Hill 70, by which time the enemy had recovered from his first surprise, had reorganized his guns, and was moving up his own supports. Tragedy befell the Scots on Hill 70 and in the Site Auguste, as I have told. Worse tragedy happened to the 21st and 24th Divisions. They became hopelessly checked and tangled in the traffic of the roads, and in their heavy kit were exhausted long before they reached the battlefield. They drank the water out of their bottles, and then were parched. They ate their iron rations, and then were hungry. Some of their transport moved too far forward in daylight, was seen by German observers, ranged on by German guns, and blown to bits on the road. The cookers were destroyed, and with them that night's food. None of the officers had been told that they were expected to attack on that day. All they anticipated was the duty of holding the old support trenches. In actual fact, they arrived when the enemy was preparing a heavy counterattack and flinging over storms of shell fire. The officers had no maps and no orders. They were utterly bewildered with the situation and had no knowledge as to the whereabouts of the enemy or their own objectives. Their men met heavy fire for the first time when their physical and moral condition was weakened by the long march, the lack of food and water, and the unexpected terror ahead of them. They crowded into broken trenches where shells burst over them and into them. Young officers acting on their own initiative tried to lead their men forward, and isolated parties went forward, but uncertainly, not knowing the ground nor their purpose. Shrapnel lashed them, and high explosive shells ploughed up the earth about them, and with them, dusk came, and then darkness. Some officers were cursing, and some wept, fearing dishonor. The men were huddled together like sheep without shepherds when wolves are about, and saw by the bewilderment of the officers that they were without leadership. It is that which makes for demoralization, and these men, who afterward in the Battle of the Somme in the following year fought with magnificent valor, were on that day at Loos demoralized in a tragic and complete way. Those who had gone forward came back to the crowded trenches and added to the panic and the rage and the anguish. Men smashed their rifles in a kind of madness. Boys were cursing and weeping at the same time. They were too hopelessly disordered and dismayed by the lack of guidance and by the shock to their sense of discipline to be of much use in that battle. Some bodies of them, in both these unhappy divisions, arrived in front of Hill 70 at the very time when the enemy launched his first counterattack, and were driven back in disorder. Some days later, I saw the 21st Division marching back behind the lines. Rain slashed them. They walked with bent heads. The young officers were blanched and had a beaten look. The sight of those dejected men was tragic and pitiful. Part 3, Chapter 14. Meanwhile, at 6 p.m. on the evening of the first day of battle, the Guards arrived at Les Mines. As I saw them march up, splendid in their height and strength and glory of youth. I looked out for the officers I knew, yet hoped I should not see them, that man who had given a farewell touch to the flowers in the garden of our billet, that other one who knew he would be wounded, those two young brothers who had played cricket on a sunny afternoon. I did not see them, but saw only columns of men, staring grimly ahead of them, with strange, unspeakable thoughts behind their mask-like faces. It was not until the morning of the 26th that the Commander-in-Chief placed them at the disposal of the General Officer commanding First Army, and it was on the afternoon of Monday, the 27th, that they were ordered to attack. By that time we had lost Fosse 8, one brigade of the 9th Scottish Division, having been flung back to its own trenches after desperate fighting, at frightful cost, after the capture of the Hohenzollern redoubt by the 26th Brigade of that division. To the north of them, the 7th Division was also suffering horrible losses after the capture of the quarries near Hollach and the village of Heisnes, which afterward was lost. The commanding officers of both divisions, General Capper of the 7th and General Thesiger of the 9th, were killed as they reconnoitred the ground, and wounded men were pouring down to the casualty clearing stations if they had the luck to get so far. Some of them had not that luck, but lay for nearly 2 days before they were rescued by the stretcher-bearers from Quality Street and Philosopher. It was bad all along the line. The whole plan had gone astray from the beginning. With an optimism which was splendid in fighting men and costly in the high command, our men had attacked positions of enormous strength, held by an enemy in the full height of his power, without sufficient troops in reserve to follow up and support the initial attack, to consolidate the ground and resist inevitable counterattacks. What reserves the Commander-in-Chief had he held in his own hand too long and too far back? The Guards went in when the enemy was reorganized to meet them. The 28th Division, afterward in support, was too late to be a decisive factor. I do not blame Lord French. I have no right to blame him, as I am not a soldier nor a military expert. He did his best with the highest motives. The blunders he made were due to ignorance of modern battles. Many other generals made many other blunders, and our men paid with their lives. Our high command had to learn by mistakes, by ghastly mistakes, repeated often, until they became visible to the military mind, and were paid for again by the slaughter of British youth. One does not blame. A writing man, who was an observer and recorder, like myself, does not sit in judgment. He has no right to judge. He merely cries out, O God, in remembrance of all that agony and that waste of splendid boys who loved life and died. On Sunday, as I have told, the situation was full of danger. The Scots of the 15th Division, weakened by many losses and exhausted by their long fatigue, had been forced to abandon the important position of Puits 14, a mine shaft half a mile north of Hill 70, linked up in defence with the enemy's redoubt on the northeast side of Hill 70. The Germans had been given time to bring up their reserves, to reorganize their broken lines, and to get their batteries into action again. There was a consultation of anxious brigadiers in Loos, where no man could find safe shelter, owing to the heavy shelling which now ravaged among the houses. Rations were running short, and rain fell through the roofless ruins, and officers and men shivered in wet clothes. Dead bodies blown into bits, headless trunks, pools of blood, made a ghastly mess in the roadways and the houses. Badly wounded men were dragged down into the cellars, and lay there in the filth of Friday's fighting. The headquarters of one of the London brigades had put up in a roofless barn, but were shelled out, and settled down on some heaps of brick in the open. It was as cold as death in the night, and no fire could be lighted, and iron rations were the only food, until 2 chaplains, R.C. and Church of England, no difference of dogma then, came up as volunteers in a perilous adventure with bottles of hot soup in mackintoshes. They brought a touch of human warmth to the brigade staff, made those hours of the night more endurable, but the men farther forward had no such luck. They were famishing and soaked, in a cold hell, where shells tossed up the earth about them and spattered them with the blood and flesh of their comrades. On Monday morning the situation was still more critical, all along the line, and the Guards were ordered up to attack Hill 70, to which only a few Scots were clinging on the near slopes. The 6th Cavalry Brigade dismounted no more dreams of exploiting success, and galloping round Lens were sent into Loos with orders to hold the village at all cost, with the men of the 15th Division who had been left there. The Londoners were still holding on to the chalk pit south of Loos, under murderous fire. It was a bad position for the troops sent into action at that stage. The result of the battle on September 25th had been to create a salient thrust like a wedge into the German position and enfiladed by their guns. The sides of the salient ran sharply back from Hullock in the north, past the chalk quarries to Givenchy, and in the south from the lower slopes of Hill 70 past the double Crassier to Grenay. The orders given to the Guards were to straighten out this salient on the north by capturing the whole of Hill 70, Puits 14, to the north of it, and the chalk pit still farther north. It was the 2D Brigade of Guards, including Grenadiers, Welsh and Scots Guards, which was to lead the assault, while the 1st Brigade on the left maintained a holding position and the 3D Brigade was in support, immediately behind. As soon as the Guards started to attack, they were met by a heavy storm of gas shells. This checked them for a time, as smoke helmets, the old-fashioned things of flannel, which were afterward changed for the masks with nozzles, had to be served out, and already men were choking and gasping in the poisonous fumes. Among them was the colonel of the Grenadiers, whose command was taken over by the major. Soon the men advanced again, looking like devils, as, in artillery formation, small separate groups, they groped their way through the poisoned clouds. Shrapnel and high explosives burst over them and among them, and many men fell as they came within close range of the enemy's positions running from Hill 70 northward to the chalk pit. The Irish Guards, supported by the Coldstreamers, advanced down the valley beyond Luce and gained the lower edge of Bois Hugo near the chalk pit, while the Scots Guards assaulted Puits 14 and the building in its group of houses known as the Keep. Another body of Guards, including Grenadiers and Welsh, attacked at the same time the lower slopes of Hill 70. Puits 14 itself was won by a party of Scots Guards, led by an officer named Captain Cuthbert, which engaged in hand-to-hand fighting, routing out the enemy from the houses. Some companies of the Grenadiers came to the support of their comrades in the Scots Guards, but suffered heavy losses themselves. A platoon under a young lieutenant named Aris Ritchie reached the Puits, and storming their way into the keep, knocked out a machine gun, mounted on the second floor, by a desperate bombing attack. The officer held on in a most dauntless way to the position, until almost every man was either killed or wounded, unable to receive support, owing to the enfilade fire of the German machine guns. Night had now come on, the sky lightened by the bursting of shells and flares, and terrible in its tumult of battle. Some of the Coldstreamers had gained possession of the chalk pit, which they were organizing into a strong defensive position, and various companies of the Guards divisions, after heroic assaults upon Hill 70, where they were shattered by the fire, which met them on the crest, from the enemy's redoubt on the northeast side, had dug themselves into the lower slopes. There was a strange visitor that day at the headquarters of the Guards division, where Lord Cavan was directing operations. A young officer came in and said, "Quite calmly, sir, I have to report that my battalion has been cut to pieces. We have been utterly destroyed." Lord Cavan questioned him and then sent for another officer. "Look after that young man," he said quietly. "He is mad. It is a case of shell shock." Reports came through of a mysterious officer going the round of the batteries, saying that the Germans had broken through and that they had better retire. 2 batteries did actually move away. Another unknown officer called out, "Retire, retire," until he was shot through the head. "German spies," said some of our officers and men, but the intelligence branch said, "Not spies, madmen, poor devils." Before the dawn came, the Coldstreamers made another desperate attempt to attack and hold Puits 14, but the position was too deadly, even for their height of valor, and although some men pushed on into this raging fire, the survivors had to fall back to the woods, where they strengthened their defensive works. On the following day the position was the same, the sufferings of our men being still further increased by heavy shelling from 8-inch howitzers. Colonel Egerton of the Coldstream Guards and his adjutant were killed in the chalk pit. It was now seen by the headquarters staff of the Guards division that Puits 14 was untenable, owing to its enfilading by heavy artillery, and the order was given for a retirement to the chalk pit, which was a place of sanctuary, owing to the wonderful work done throughout the night to strengthen its natural defensive features by sandbags and barbed wire, in spite of machine guns which raked it from the neighboring woods. The retirement was done as though the men were on parade, slowly, and in perfect order, across the field of fire, each man bearing himself, so their officers told me, as though at the trooping of the colours, until now one and then another fell in a huddled heap. It was an astonishing tribute to the strength of tradition among troops. To safeguard the honour of a famous name, these men showed such dignity in the presence of death that even the enemy must have been moved to admiration. but they had failed, after suffering heavy losses, and the commander-in-chief had to call upon the French for help, realizing that without strong assistance the salient made by that Battle of Loos would be a death trap. The French 10th Army had failed, too, at Vimy, thus failing to give the British troops protection on their right flank. On representing this to General Joffre, wrote Sir John French, he was kind enough to ask the commander of the northern group of French armies to render us assistance. General Foch met those demands in the same friendly spirit which he has always displayed throughout the course of the whole campaign, and expressed his readiness to give me all the support he could. On the morning of the 28th we discussed the situation, and the general agreed to send the 9th French Corps to take over the ground occupied by us, extending from the French left up to and including that portion of Hill 70 which we were holding, and also the village of Loos. This relief was commenced on September 30th and completed on the 2 following nights. So ended the Battle of Loos, except for a violent counter-attack delivered on October 8th, all along the line from Fossate on the north to the right of the French 9th Corps on the south, with 28 battalions in the first line of assault. It was preceded by a stupendous bombardment which inflicted heavy casualties upon our 1st Division in the neighborhood of the Chalk Pit, and upon the guards holding the Hohenzollern redoubt near Hulluch. Once again those brigades, which had been sorely tried, had to crouch under a fury of fire until the living were surrounded by dead, half buried or carved up into chunks of flesh in the chaos of broken trenches. The Germans had their own shambles, more frightful, we were told, than ours, and thousands of dead lay in front of our lines when the tide of their attack ebbed back and waves of living men were broken by the fire of our field guns, rifles, and machine guns. Sir John French's staff estimated the number of German dead as from 8 to 9,000. It was impossible to make any accurate sum in that arithmetic of slaughter, and always the enemy's losses were exaggerated because of the dreadful need of balancing accounts in new-made corpses in the debit and credit of war's bookkeeping. What had we gained by great sacrifices of life? Not Lens, nor Lille, nor even Hill 70, for our line had to be withdrawn from those bloody slopes where our men left many of their dead, but another sharp-edged salient enfiladed by German guns for 2 years more, and a foothold on one slag heap of the double Crassier, where our men lived, if they could, a few yards from Germans on the other, and that part of the Hohenzollern redoubt, which became another Hooge, where English youth was blown up by mines, buried by trench mortars, condemned to a living death in lousy caves dug into the chalk. Another V-shaped salient, narrower than that of Ypres, more dismal, and as deadly among the pit heads and the black dust hills and the broken mine shafts of that foul country beyond Loos. The battle which had been begun with such high hopes ended in ghastly failure by ourselves and by the French. Men who came back from it spoke in whispers of its generalship and staff work, and said things which were dangerous to speak aloud, cursing their fate as fighting men, asking of God as well as of mortals why the courage of the soldiers they led should be thrown away in such a muck of slaughter, laughing with despairing mirth at the optimism of their leaders, who had been lured on by a strange, false, terrible belief in German weakness, and looking ahead at unending vistas of such massacre as this, which would lead only to other salients, after desperate and futile endeavor.
This concludes the 7th part of 18 total of Now It Can Be Told by Philip Gibbs, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.